My name is Kate Sterling. I am 62 years old and the silent architect of my family wealth. 3 weeks ago, my husband of 35 years slid a legal document across our kitchen table and smiled. He told me my mind was slipping and that I needed to sign away my entire life savings to our son-in-law. He did not know that while he was busy planning my future in a nursing home, I had already quietly transferred his company, his luxury estate, and every single dollar he thought he owned into an irrevocable trust controlled only by me. Before I tell you exactly how I left my arrogant husband and greedy children with absolutely nothing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been an older woman who was severely underestimated by the people she sacrificed everything for. It was a Tuesday morning when the final insult happened. The bright morning sun was pouring into the kitchen of our $12 million Westchester estate. I was standing at the marble island, calmly peeling a green apple with a small paring knife. Well, my husband walked in wearing his custom Italian suit, smelling of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. He did not say good morning. Instead, he dropped a thick stack of freshly printed legal papers right next to the chipped ceramic teapot we bought on our honeymoon 35 years ago. The contrast between that old precious memory and the crisp white pages of my financial death warrant was almost poetic. Will adjusted his silk tie and tapped the papers. "The lawyers say you are starting to show signs of cognitive decline, Kate." He said it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Just sign this power of attorney. Let Marcus manage your retirement accounts and your trust fund. It is safer that way." I kept peeling my apple. The skin fell away in one long, unbroken ribbon. Marcus was our daughter husband. He was a flashy wealth manager who drove a leased sports car and thought he was the smartest man in every room. Will poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Oh, and one more thing," he added, looking out the window instead of at me. "My new assistant Vanessa is moving into the guest house this afternoon. She is 28 and she is pregnant, so I want you to make sure the place is completely cleaned out and comfortable for her. Do not make a fuss about it." He took a sip of his coffee, checked his heavy gold watch, and walked out the door without even waiting for my answer. He assumed I would just obey. He assumed 35 years of playing the quiet, supportive wife meant I had no teeth left. I set down my knife. I looked at the signature line on the power of attorney document where Marcus had already boldly signed his name. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just picked up the document, dropped it into the kitchen trash can, and opened my laptop. It was time to show them exactly how sharp my memory really was. The heavy oak front door had barely clicked shut behind Will when it swung violently open again. The sharp clicking of designer heels echoed across the marble foyer and into the kitchen. It was Chloe, our 34-year-old daughter. She did not knock. She did not say hello. She just marched straight to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of imported sparkling water, and turned to face me. "Mom, we have a slight change of plans for the weekend," she announced. Her voice was loud and carried that specific kind of exhausting authority that only comes from someone who has never had to work a day in her life. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than most people make in a month, and she looked incredibly annoyed. I kept my eyes on the kitchen island, wiping down the marble surface with a slow, steady rhythm. "What kind of plans, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Well, Marcus finally found the boat he has been looking for," she said, waving her hand dismissively as if buying a luxury watercraft was the same as picking up groceries. "It is a gorgeous 70-foot yacht down at the marina. The dealer is holding it for us, but the financing is taking too long. You know how these banks are always dragging their feet, making Marcus jump through hoops just to clear a simple $2 million loan. It is ridiculous, honestly, given his position at the firm. We have invited half the yacht club to a launch party next weekend, and it would be incredibly humiliating if we had to rent a boat like some kind of tourists. Marcus has a reputation to uphold." I stopped wiping the counter. I looked at her. "And how does your husband financing a yacht involve me?" Chloe rolled her eyes and took a long drink of her water. "God, Mom, you are always so slow to catch on lately." Dad was right. Anyway, Marcus told the bank he could collateralize the loan with the Aspen property. You know the ski lodge. It is just sitting there collecting dust. You and Dad never even go there anymore. So Marcus had his office draft up the paperwork to transfer the deed temporarily into his holding company, just to secure the loan. You just need to sign it today so he can get the boat before the weekend. She said it all in one breath. She wanted to use the Aspen house as collateral for a toy. She spoke about the property as if it were a forgotten sweater left in the back of a closet. I slowly reached my hand into the deep pocket of my linen apron. My fingers brushed against a heavy brass key. It was the spare key to the Aspen house. The cold metal grounded me. As my thumb traced the familiar grooves of that key, I let myself remember exactly how that house was bought. Chloe thought her father bought it. Everyone did. But 30 years ago, before Will and his company were anything more than a struggling startup, I took a massive independent contract as a forensic accountant. I spent 6 months untangling a massive corporate fraud case. The bonus I earned from that single job paid for the Aspen property in cash. It was mine. It was the first thing I ever bought entirely on my own, and I placed it directly into an ironclad trust. I looked at my daughter. She was tapping her manicured nails against the marble island, completely oblivious to the silence filling the room. "Does your father know Marcus is trying to mortgage the Aspen house?" I asked calmly. Chloe scoffed. "Of course he knows. Dad said it was a brilliant financial move. He said you would not mind because you are getting too old for the altitude anyway. Honestly, Mom, you should be thanking Marcus. He is taking a dead asset and leveraging it for our family lifestyle. You do not understand how modern finance works. Sitting on a paid-off property is just lazy investing. Marcus says it is dead equity. He is actually doing you a favor by putting that equity to work. When he flips the yacht in a few years, he might even give you a small percentage of the profit to put toward your retirement care. Dad said you guys were looking at that luxury assisted living facility in Connecticut, the one with the indoor pool. That sounds nice, right? You will be comfortable, and we will not have to worry about you wandering around this massive house alone." The sheer entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She was standing in my kitchen drinking my water and casually explaining how she and her husband were going to gamble away my hard-earned property. "You want me to sign over the deed today?" I repeated, making sure I understood the absolute audacity of her request. "Yes, today, Mom," she snapped, checking her phone. "Marcus will be here in an hour with the notary. Just make sure you are ready, and please do not make it a whole dramatic thing. You embarrassed him last Thanksgiving when you asked all those questions about his crypto investments. Just sign the paper. He is a professional wealth manager. He knows what he is doing better than you do. You just bake pies and garden. Let the men handle the real money." I kept my hand in my pocket holding the brass key. I felt a small cold smile form on my lips. It was the kind of smile you give when you realize the people trying to destroy you have just handed you the hammer. She looked at me and frowned. "Why are you smiling?" "It is creepy. Just go find a pen and be ready when Marcus gets here. I have to go to a fitting for the gala. Oh, and Mom, make sure you tell the housekeeping staff to clear out the guest house today. Dad told me Vanessa is moving in. She's going to need the good linens. See you later." Chloe turned on her heel and marched out of the kitchen, leaving her half-empty water bottle on the island. The front door slammed shut. The house was quiet again. I pulled my hand out of my pocket and looked at the Aspen key. They wanted the deed. They wanted the power. They thought I was just a tired old woman who baked pies and nodded along. They had absolutely no idea that the Aspen house was legally untouchable. And they had no idea that by trying to fraudulently leverage a property owned by my private trust, Marcus had just committed federal wire fraud. I did not need a pen to sign his paperwork. I just needed to let him hang himself. Exactly 45 minutes later, the heavy oak door opened again. Deliberate, confident footsteps echoed through the hallway and into the kitchen. Marcus walked in carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He was wearing a custom navy suit that looked like it cost more than most cars. He flashed me a bright, rehearsed smile. It was the exact kind of smile a salesman gives right before he tries to rip you off. "Good morning, Mother Kate," he said, setting his briefcase on the clean marble island. "Chloe said she spoke to you about the little update to our portfolio strategy. I hope she did not confuse you with too much financial jargon. She means well, but she does not quite grasp the macroeconomic mechanics of what we are doing here. I poured myself a cup of tea. I watched him unclasp his briefcase. Macroeconomic mechanics. I repeated, letting the words sound heavy and clumsy in my mouth. That sounds very complicated, Marcus. He chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. It is Mother Kate. The financial landscape has shifted drastically since you and Will were building your nest egg. Holding on to stagnant real estate like the Aspen property is practically a liability in today's market. You are bleeding potential yield. We call it dead equity. What I am doing by collateralizing it is waking up that sleeping capital. I am shifting it into a high-velocity asset class. The yacht is not just a boat, Mother Kate. It is a networking vehicle, a floating boardroom where I can close 8-figure deals for my firm. He pulled a crisp stack of papers from his briefcase and slid them across the marble along with a heavy silver pen. I looked at the top page. It was a transfer of deed and a collateral agreement. He had already filled out all the details, including my name and my address. Now I know Will mentioned the power of attorney earlier, he continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, comforting tone. Think of this as the first step in streamlining your estate. You have worked hard raising Chloe and taking care of this massive house. You deserve to relax. You should not be stressing over property taxes and maintenance fees for a cabin you never visit anymore. Let me carry that burden for you. Once you sign this, the Aspen deed temporarily transfers to my holding company. The bank clears my loan by Friday, and you never have to think about it again. I will even make sure my firm covers your assisted living deposit when you and Will decide it is time to downsize next year. He tapped the paper with a perfectly manicured finger. Just right here at the bottom, Mother Kate. And do not worry about a notary. I have a guy at my office who handles all my remote signatures. Just a formality, really. I looked at the silver pen. Then I looked at Marcus. His eyes were completely void of respect. He looked at me the way a wolf looks at a very old and very tired sheep. He truly believed I was nothing more than an accessory to Will. A quiet domestic shadow who did not understand the big, scary world of high finance. Marcus, I asked, keeping my voice soft and hesitant, are you sure this is entirely legal, putting my house into your company name to buy a boat? The bank does not mind that sort of thing. He laughed out loud this time, shaking his head. Oh, Mother Kate, you watch entirely too many true crime shows. This is standard corporate maneuvering. Rich people do this every single day. It is how real wealth is built and protected. Trust me on this. I manage millions of dollars for some of the smartest men in New York. I know exactly what I'm doing. You just need to trust the process and trust your family. Now go ahead and sign so I can get back to the city. The markets wait for no one. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy and cold in my hand. I did not sign the paper. Instead, I slowly moved the pen to the side of the document. I looked up at him with a perfectly blank expression. I think I need to read this over first, Marcus, I said quietly. My eyes are not what they used to be. I will look at it tonight and give it to Will tomorrow morning. Marcus frowned. The smooth salesman facade cracked for a second, showing the irritated, spoiled boy underneath. Mother Kate, the bank needs this today. Will already approved it. There is nothing to read. It is standard boilerplate text. Do not make this difficult. Chloe was right, you are getting terribly stubborn lately. I just smiled a small, fragile smile. Tomorrow, Marcus. Tell the bank they will have to wait one more day. He stared at me, his jaw tight. He snatched the papers off the counter and shoved them roughly back into his briefcase. Fine, but Will is going to hear about this. You are jeopardizing a major business move because of your paranoia. Read it tonight. I will send a courier tomorrow morning. Have it signed by 9. He turned and marched out of the kitchen. The front door slammed for the third time that morning. I waited until the sound of his sports car engine faded down the long driveway. The house was completely silent again. I took a sip of my tea. It was still warm. I walked over to my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. I set it on the island, right where Marcus had just tried to steal my property. I opened the screen. The dark display flickered to life. I did not open a recipe blog or a gardening forum. I opened a highly secure encrypted browser. I typed in a web address known only to federal auditors and high-level financial investigators. The screen loaded, displaying the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. A login prompt appeared, requesting an expert identification number. I typed in the 12-digit code I had maintained active for over 3 decades. The system welcomed me. I clicked on a tab labeled Suspicious Activity Reports and Corporate Fraud. Marcus thought he was dealing with a confused old woman. He did not realize he had just handed a documented confession of attempted wire fraud directly to a retired forensic accountant. A slow, genuine smile finally spread across my face. The hunt was on. I closed my laptop and left the house. The crisp afternoon air felt sharp against my face as I drove my car down the winding roads of Westchester. I needed to pick up the custom floral arrangements for the anniversary party. It was supposed to be a simple errand, a quick swipe of my titanium bank card. But Will and Marcus had already set their trap. I walked into the private wealth management branch of our bank. The marble floors gleamed, and the air smelled of expensive polished wood. I approached the teller, a young woman named Sarah, who always asked about my garden. I handed her my card and asked for a cashier check to pay the florist. Sarah swiped the card. The machine beeped, a soft, sharp sound that felt entirely too loud in the quiet bank. Sarah frowned and swiped it again. She looked at her screen and the color drained completely from her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. "Mrs. Sterling, I am so sorry," she stammered. "The system is telling me I need to call the branch manager. Please excuse me for just one moment." I stood at the counter and waited. I did not check my phone or look around. I just watched Sarah hurry toward the glass office in the back. A minute later, Thomas, the senior branch manager, stepped out. Thomas was a man who prided himself on control. He wore impeccably tailored suits and always had a perfectly smooth greeting for his high-net-worth clients. But right now, Thomas was sweating. He was walking toward me, and he looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "Could you please step into my office?" I followed him into the glass room. He closed the blinds, a gesture that told me exactly how bad this was going to be. He did not sit behind his large mahogany desk. Instead, he stood nervously beside it, clutching a manila folder to his chest. "Kate." I do not know how to say this. He began dropping the formal title. "Your accounts are frozen. All of them. The joint checking the savings and your personal credit lines." I sat down slowly in the leather chair opposite his desk. "Frozen by whom?" Thomas, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. He swallowed hard. He opened the folder with shaking hands and slid a document across the desk. It was a copy of the power of attorney, the same one Will had tried to force me to sign that morning. Only this one was fully executed. "Will and your son-in-law Marcus came in 2 hours ago," Thomas explained. His eyes darted away from mine. They presented this document along with a letter from a private physician. The letter states that you are suffering from severe cognitive decline. It grants Marcus full financial conservatorship over your assets. The legal department flagged it and approved the freeze immediately. I looked at the document. It was a masterpiece of forgery and sheer arrogance. This is the oldest trick in the world for men like Will. When an older woman becomes inconvenient, you do not argue with her. You simply declare her incompetent. You strip her of her resources, and you let society agree that she is just losing her mind. They thought that without access to my daily funds, I would panic. They thought I would come crawling back to Will, begging for an allowance, just to buy groceries for my own household. Thomas leaned forward, resting his trembling hands on the desk. "Kate, listen to me," he whispered. "I know this is wrong. I have known you for 20 years. I know exactly who you are, and I know what you did for this bank during the federal audit in 1998. I know you are sharper than every executive in this building combined." I looked up at him. His fear was palpable. Thomas knew about my past as a forensic accountant. He remembered how I had quietly dismantled a massive embezzlement scheme that would have ruined his entire career. He knew I was not a fragile old woman. "Then unfreeze the accounts." "Thomas," I said simply. "I cannot," he pleaded. His voice cracked. "Corporate legal processed the paperwork. It is an airtight medical and legal injunction. If I override it, they will fire me, and Will has threatened to sue the bank for negligence." Marcus was very aggressive. He made a massive scene in the lobby. "My hands are completely tied until you can get a judge to overturn the medical evaluation. I am so deeply sorry." He looked like he was about to cry. He was a coward, but he was a useful coward. He was giving me exactly the information I needed. Marcus and Will were moving much faster than I anticipated. They were escalating the war. They wanted me destitute before the anniversary party tomorrow night, so I would have no choice but to surrender my pride in front of all our friends. I reached across the desk and picked up the fake medical letter. I folded it neatly and slipped it into my purse. "Do not apologize, Thomas," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "You are just doing your job. You are following the paperwork. I appreciate you showing me this." He looked at me with a mixture of extreme relief and absolute terror. "You are not angry?" he asked. I smiled at him. It was a cold, calculating smile. "Why would I be angry, Thomas? They have simply given me the blueprint of their own destruction. Falsifying medical records to seize financial control is a federal offense. Marcus just handed me the weapon I need to end his career permanently." I turned and walked to the door. I paused with my hand on the handle and looked back at him. "Oh, and Thomas," I added softly. "When the federal investigators come asking for the security footage of Marcus and Will submitting these forged documents tomorrow, make sure the tapes are perfectly clear. It would be a massive shame if you were named as an accomplice in a wire fraud investigation." Thomas went completely pale. He nodded, frantically unable to speak. I walked out of his office and out of the bank. The afternoon sun was still shining, but the air felt entirely different now. The gloves were officially off. They wanted to back me into a corner. They wanted to make me feel small and helpless. But they forgot one crucial detail about women like me. When you back a seasoned predator into a corner, you do not make her surrender. You just force her to bare her teeth. I got into my car and started the engine. I did not have the flowers for the party, but I had something much better. The drive home felt incredibly peaceful. I drove up the long, curved driveway toward the estate. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the carefully trimmed lawn. I had expected to see a moving truck parked beneath the guest house exactly as Will had instructed that morning. Instead, I saw a white commercial truck sitting brazenly right in front of the main entrance. The heavy oak doors stood wide open. I stepped into the foyer and immediately heard a voice echoing from the great living room. It was a shrill, demanding voice, the kind of voice that belonged to a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. "No, that is completely wrong," the voice rang out. Will said, "We're redecorating this entire room. The baby needs a bright and airy environment. That enormous dark oil painting looks absolutely depressing. Take it down right now and move it to the garage along with the rest of that old junk." I walked quietly into the living room. Standing in the middle of my imported Persian rug was Vanessa. She was 28, dressed in designer maternity clothes that Will had almost certainly bought with company money. She was holding a silver clipboard and pointing directly at the massive landscape painting hanging above the marble fireplace. It was my favorite piece in the entire house. A man in a gray work uniform was standing on a tall aluminum ladder. He had one hand stretched toward the heavy gilded frame. He stopped when he heard my footsteps and looked down at me. Vanessa turned around. She saw me standing there. She showed no embarrassment at being caught issuing orders in my own home. She showed no remorse either. In fact, she smiled. It was a cruel, triumphant little smirk that told me exactly what Will had been saying about me behind my back. "Oh, hello, Kate," she said. Her tone dripped with sweet fake pity. "Will told me you'd be out all afternoon running errands for the party. I hope you don't mind, but I decided to get an early start on the nursery renovation. Will and I talked this morning and we realized the guest house is simply too small for a growing family. So we'll be moving into the east wing of the main house." I stood there and looked at her. She casually rubbed her slightly rounded belly. It was a calculated gesture designed to provoke me. She was standing in the house I had managed and maintained for 35 years, acting as though she had inherited the entire kingdom. "Will said you'd be moving into an assisted living facility very soon," she continued. Her voice carried clearly through the quiet room. "He mentioned that your memory has been declining lately. It's terribly sad, Kate. But don't worry. We'll make sure you're comfortable wherever you end up. In the meantime, I'm just clearing out some of these outdated things. We're going for a much more modern aesthetic for the baby." She turned her back on me and looked up at the worker on the ladder. "Well, go on," she snapped impatiently. "Take it down before my designer gets here." The worker looked at me. He was young, and it was obvious he felt uncomfortable being trapped in the middle of a family battlefield. He shifted uneasily on the ladder and placed his hand on the heavy gold frame. I walked slowly into the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not show even the slightest hint of anger or panic. I simply looked at the worker and gave him a polite, understanding smile. "Excuse me, young man," I said gently. He paused again and looked down at me. "Yes, ma'am. When you take that painting down, please be extremely careful with the upper right corner of the frame," I instructed him. My voice remained perfectly calm and measured. Vanessa crossed her arms and glared at me. "Why make such a big deal out of it?" she sneered. "It's going to end up in that dark garage until we throw it away anyway." I ignored her completely and kept my eyes on the young man. Because I said clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding, there is a high-definition, motion-activated security camera embedded inside the molding of that frame. It streams directly to the cloud and cannot be erased from the server in the main house. It has been recording high-quality audio and video of this room 24 hours a day for the past 5 years. Please make sure the wiring remains completely intact when you move it. The worker froze completely. Slowly, he pulled his hand away from the frame and nodded. Then he climbed down the ladder and took a step back from the fireplace. Vanessa's arms dropped to her sides. The smug, self-satisfied smile vanished from her face instantly. She stared up at the painting, then back at me. The color drained from her face until it turned a sickly gray. "A camera," she whispered. Her voice had lost all its arrogance and authority. "Why would you keep a hidden camera in your own living room?" At last I looked at her. I let my eyes drift slowly down over her expensive designer maternity dress, then back up to her horrified face. "Because, Vanessa," I replied simply, "I am a retired forensic auditor. I spent my entire career building airtight legal cases against people who steal things that do not belong to them. I have always found it best to keep a continuous, verifiable record of exactly who enters my house and exactly what they say when they think no one is watching." I turned and started toward the hallway. "Oh, and Vanessa," I added without looking back, "make sure you pack carefully when you move into the guest house tonight. The east wing of this house belongs to an irrevocable trust, and your name is not listed among the beneficiaries. Have a lovely afternoon." I left her standing there frozen in the middle of the living room. The silence in the house was absolute perfection. They thought they were playing a game of chess with a blind, confused old woman. They had no idea that I was the one who had built the board. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I knew I had walked straight into a trap. All 4 of them were already there waiting for me. The air in the massive room felt thick, suffocating, and openly hostile. They were spaced apart, but together they formed a perfect half-circle, cutting off every possible escape route from the kitchen island. Will my husband stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the refrigerator, his eyes cold and dripping with arrogance. Marcus, my son-in-law, stood beside the coffee machine with a bitter, hostile scowl carved across his face. Chloe, the daughter I had loved and spoiled for years, sat on a bar stool with her legs crossed, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the stone countertop. And Jason, my 30-year-old youngest son, stood squarely in the center of the room, blocking the main path like a guard at the gate. They did not look like a family. They looked like a pack of starving wolves cornering their prey. I stopped at the doorway, my hand still gripping the strap of my handbag. "Where the hell have you been?" Marcus spoke first. His voice carried not even the slightest trace of respect. It slammed against the tiled walls, sharp with anger. "The bank manager just called me. You went there. You actually tried to withdraw money after I froze the account. Did you seriously think you could get around me?" I did not answer him. I walked slowly into the kitchen and moved toward the island. Will stepped forward at once, closing the gap. "You are no longer in control," Kate Will said, his voice low, threatening, and heavy with authority. "The medical papers have already gone through. You are mentally unstable, your memory is failing, and your behavior is irrational. Everything you're doing right now only proves I was right to give Marcus legal guardianship over you." I looked at Will. The man I had sacrificed my youth for, the man whose financial disasters I had cleaned up again and again to keep him out of legal trouble. And now he was looking at me like I was nothing more than trash that needed to be cleared away so his younger, pregnant mistress could take my place. Jason stepped closer. He pulled the latest model phone from his pocket and shoved it right in front of my face. On the screen was a long social media post already written and ready to go. "Look carefully, Mom," Jason said, his voice full of challenge and menace. "I've finished a very detailed post. I'm ready to publish it on every social platform right now. I'm going to tell the whole world how you emotionally abused me throughout my childhood. I'm going to say you were a narcissistic mother who controlled her children and destroyed them psychologically. You know how the internet works now. They'll tear you apart. You'll never be able to show your face in this town again." Chloe took a sip of water and joined in with infuriating calm. "He's right, Mom. You've hurt Jason for years. You never supported his startup. He only needs your shares in Dad's real estate company as seed money. Why are you clinging to those shares when you've never contributed anything to the company anyway? All you ever did was stay home and bake." Then all of them moved one step closer. The circle tightened. My back touched the cold marble edge of the kitchen counter. I could smell Will's expensive cologne mixing with the bitter scent of burnt coffee from Marcus's cup. The combination made me feel physically sick. "You are going to sign the stock transfer papers to Jason right now," Marcus ordered as he stepped forward and slammed a thick folder onto the counter beside my hand. "Then you'll sign over the Aspen house to me. If you cooperate, we'll make sure you get a decent room in the nursing home. But if you keep being stubborn," Jason presses publish, "and tomorrow at your 35th wedding anniversary party, you'll be the laughingstock of 200 guests." Will planted both hands on the counter, trapping me between his arms. Then he leaned in close, his face only inches from mine. "End this now, Kate," he whispered. "You have no cash. Your cards are locked. You do not have a single ally left in this house. Stop humiliating yourself. Vanessa already moved into the guest house this afternoon. Tomorrow is my retirement announcement and our anniversary party. I will not have you causing a scandal in front of the press." The pressure from all four of them was suffocating. Any other 62-year-old woman might have collapsed right there, covering her face and sobbing. Any other woman might have panicked, grabbed the pen, and signed away everything just to buy a little fake peace and protect her reputation online. That was exactly what they wanted. They wanted to use numbers, noise, and humiliation to crush my will. Slowly, I lifted my head. I looked into each of their eyes one by one. First, Will the traitor, then Chloe, the ungrateful daughter, then Marcus, the greedy, manipulative fraud, and finally Jason, the son who was trying to blackmail his own mother with her honor. My heart beat slowly, steadily, like a drum before war. There was no fear in me, not even a trace, because decades ago, my forensic auditor training taught me one rule that never fails: when your enemies put on a show of strength to back you into a corner, that is exactly when they expose the most weakness. They thought they had already won. They thought this wall of flesh and intimidation was unbreakable. But what they did not understand was this: when you corner a wolf, you do not make it weaker. You simply give it the perfect reason to tear out every throat in the room without feeling a single ounce of guilt. I closed my eyes and slowly let my tense shoulders relax. I allowed my face to fall, shaping it into the perfect expression of exhaustion and defeat. Then I let out a long, trembling breath. It was a flawless performance, the performance of an aging woman who had finally been crushed by the unbearable pressure of her own family. "All right," I whispered weakly, my voice barely audible. "You win." All four of them went silent at once. The thick, suffocating tension that had filled the kitchen shattered in an instant. Will loosened his silk tie ever so slightly and let out a long breath of relief. Chloe curled her lips into a smug little smile and glanced sideways at Marcus. "You mean that?" Marcus asked, carefully stepping closer. "You'll sign the power of attorney and the transfer papers for the Aspen house to my company, and my shares too?" "Mom!" Jason quickly cut in hurriedly, shoving the phone with his blackmail post back into his pocket. I nodded slowly and opened my eyes, looking at them with the hollow stare of someone who had finally surrendered to fate. "Yes," I said. "I'll sign everything you want. But I have one condition." Will frowned immediately and took a cautious step forward. "What condition, Kate? Don't start playing games. There are no games." Will I replied in a tired, resigned voice. Tomorrow is our 35th wedding anniversary party. It's also your retirement announcement. 200 of the most important people in New York real estate will be there. I want to keep the last scrap of dignity I have left. I will sign every transfer document tomorrow night at the party in front of your business partners. Have all the paperwork prepared. I'll formally hand over the assets and control to the younger generation in a graceful and respectable way. Marcus burst out laughing and slapped Will hard on the shoulder. A public transfer of power at the party, he said, grinning like he had already won the world. Father-in-law. This will make our family look incredible in front of the investors. No one will ever say we forced her. She'll be doing it voluntarily in front of witnesses. This is perfect. A flawless PR move. Will nodded in agreement. A flash of greed and satisfaction lit up his eyes. He walked over to the liquor cabinet, pulled out an expensive bottle of champagne, and poured 4 crystal glasses. He did not pour one for me. "Let's raise a glass," Will announced loudly, "to the future of the Sterling family, and to your final act of cooperation, Kate." Chloe, Jason, and Marcus all lifted their glasses. The sharp clink of crystal echoed through the kitchen. They were celebrating over what they believed was my financial grave. They laughed together, relaxed and cheerful, now completely ignoring me, as if I had already become a ghost inside my own home. I turned quietly and walked out of the kitchen. Not one of them called after me. Not one of them asked how I felt. As I stepped into the dark hallway, I lifted my hand and gently touched the pendant hanging at my neck. They wanted a grand public ceremony. They wanted to put me on a stage and make me destroy myself in front of 200 people. A cold smile slowly spread across my face in the darkness, a deadly smile, because they had no idea they had just built the perfect execution platform for themselves with their own hands. Oh, I would absolutely step onto that stage tomorrow. But the file I would be carrying would not be a set of transfer papers. It would be a financial death sentence for every single one of them. Everything was already in place. Now all that remained was to let them enjoy the last peaceful night of sleep they would ever have. At 7 o'clock the following evening, our $12 million estate blazed like a diamond in the dark. 200 guests had arrived, each one more powerful than the last in New York's real estate and finance circles. Supercars lined the sweeping driveway. Crystal lights shimmered over silver trays of extravagant food, champagne flutes, and expensive wine. On the surface, it was a lavish 35th wedding anniversary celebration. In truth, it was nothing more than a perfectly staged theater of lies. I descended the marble staircase slowly. I was not wearing the dull, aging dress Will had chosen for me. Instead, I wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that hugged the frame of a 62-year-old woman who knew exactly what she was worth. My hair was swept up neatly. I wore no heavy jewels, only a slim watch at my wrist. I moved with the calm, steady grace of a hunter walking into her prey territory. The moment I appeared, heads turned. But they were not looking at me with admiration. They were looking at me with pity, with curiosity, with that poisonous little whisper people use when they believe they are witnessing someone's downfall. Will had worked very hard over the last 24 hours. He and Marcus had gone from guest to guest, spreading the same story that my mind was failing, that I was becoming unstable, that I had turned into a burden they could no longer control, and that they had been forced to make a heartbreaking decision. I saw Chloe laughing with her circle of wealthy friends, bragging about the yacht she planned to buy. I saw Jason trying to impress an investor by talking about the shares he believed would soon belong to him. And I saw Marcus, my arrogant son-in-law, standing beside the bar with a glass in his hand, smiling at bank executives as though he already owned the entire empire. And of course, I saw Will. He stood at the very center of the party in a flawlessly tailored tuxedo, glowing under the lights, like a man determined to crown himself king. And beside him stood Vanessa, his young, pregnant mistress. She wore a delicate silk dress that deliberately drew attention to the slight curve of her belly. Will had his arm wrapped openly around her waist, in front of everyone, introducing her as his devoted personal assistant. It was humiliation at its most public, most deliberate, most cruel. He wanted all of New York's elite to see that I had been replaced, that I no longer mattered. The soft jazz music suddenly faded. The crowd slowly fell silent as Will stepped onto the wooden platform set up in the center of the garden. He took the microphone, and the spotlight poured down over his smug, polished face. Vanessa stood just below the stage, staring up at him with fake devotion in her eyes. Chloe, Marcus, and Jason quickly moved to the front row, forming a strong wall of family support around their beloved patriarch. "Good evening, my wonderful friends," Will began, his voice rich, commanding, and perfectly rehearsed. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the two greatest milestones of my life: 35 years of building a real estate empire from nothing, and 35 years of marriage." The crowd burst into applause. Will smiled and lifted his hand, asking for silence. Then he launched into a glowing tribute to himself. He spoke of multi-million-dollar deals, bold business decisions, and the way he had guided the company through difficult times. Not a single word about the woman who had spent countless sleepless nights cleaning up his disastrous books and saving him from one financial and legal catastrophe after another. In his version of history, he was the self-made god of his own empire. After 10 straight minutes of praising himself, Will's expression changed. The brilliant smile vanished. In its place came a carefully performed look of sorrow and pain. He lowered his voice just enough for the microphone to catch every heavy breath. "But my dear friends," he said, his voice trembling, "every success comes with a price. Tonight should have been a joyful evening, but my heart is heavy. As many of you already know, my wife, my life partner Kate, has been going through a very difficult time. Her mental health is declining rapidly. Her memories are fading, and she is no longer able to care for herself or make sound decisions." A wave of sympathetic murmurs spread through the crowd. A few women lifted their hands to their mouths in theatrical concern. Will glanced at them, fully aware he had them exactly where he wanted them. He played the grieving husband to perfection. "As the head of this family, I have had to make the hardest decisions of my life to protect her and to protect our legacy," he continued. "That is why tonight, in front of all the people we cherish most, Kate will formally sign over power of attorney for all assets and financial authority to our son-in-law Marcus. At the same time, we have found a first-class specialized care facility where Kate can spend the rest of her years in peace, safety, and complete comfort." Peace, safety, comfort. That was how he described throwing me into a nursing home. That was how he planned to strip me of my rights, my dignity, and every last dollar I owned, all under the glow of stage lights and the cover of moral concern. Marcus stood at the front with his chest puffed out in pride. He pulled a gold-plated fountain pen from his jacket pocket, along with the transfer documents we had agreed to the day before in the kitchen. "Kate, my dear," Will called out, turning his gaze toward me where I stood at the edge of the crowd. "Please come up here. Everyone is here to support you. Let your family help you lay down this burden." 200 faces turned toward me at once. They were waiting to see a trembling, confused old woman step onto that stage with tears in her eyes and sign her own financial death warrant. They were waiting for my final surrender. I took a slow, deep breath. The cool night air filled my lungs. Then I lifted my glass and took a small sip of red wine. At last, the moment I had been waiting for all these months had arrived. The spring had been wound to its absolute limit, and now it was time for me to let go. I set my wine glass down on the marble table beside me, lifted my chin, and began walking toward the stage. Will's performance was over. Now it was my turn to own the board. I climbed the wooden steps. Each step was slow, steady, deliberate. When I reached the podium, Will smiled and stepped aside as if he were graciously handing me the stage. Marcus moved in immediately. He pulled out his gold-plawn, sick fountain pen and shoved a thick stack of documents toward me. Then in front of 200 guests, he gave my shoulder a soft little pat, putting on a performance of fake compassion. "Sign on the last page," Mother Marcus whispered just loud enough for the people in the front rows to hear. "Everything will be fine. We'll take care of you." I looked at the documents. Then I looked at the pen in his hand. I did not take it. Instead, I reached forward and gently lifted the microphone from its stand. A sharp burst of feedback screeched through the speakers, and the entire garden fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me, waiting to witness the collapse of a broken old woman. I turned and looked Marcus straight in the eye. My stare was so cold, so precise, I could actually see the smile on his lips begin to harden. "Marcus," I began. My voice rang through the microphone, clear, sharp, and perfectly controlled. Not a tremor, not a hint of hesitation. "You handed me power of attorney papers and a deed transfer for the Aspen house so you could use it as collateral to buy yourself a $2 million yacht. You told the bank I would be transferring that property to your company today." A ripple moved through the crowd. Whispers broke out at once. Will frowned and stepped forward, clearly ready to snatch the microphone from my hand, but I turned, raised one hand, and stopped him with such absolute authority that he froze in place. "But there's one very serious problem, Marcus." I continued, turning back to face my son-in-law, whose face was already losing color. "You present yourself as a brilliant wealth manager, a financial genius, and yet you made one embarrassingly basic mistake. You never bothered to verify the original ownership records of that house. You assumed that because I was a housewife, I simply held a massive asset in my personal name." Marcus swallowed hard. The hand holding the pen began to shake. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to keep his voice low. "Just sign the papers. Don't make a scene." "I can't sign these papers, Marcus." I said each word crisp and unmistakable, because I do not own the Aspen house in my personal capacity. That property is owned exclusively by a limited liability company I established 30 years ago, and that company is the core asset of an irrevocable trust over which I am the sole controlling authority. The whispers in the crowd instantly turned into open shock. The bank executives, the lawyers, the financial people in attendance. They all understood immediately what that meant. That means, I said, allowing a smile to touch my lips, a smile with no warmth in it at all when you submitted your mortgage loan application to the bank yesterday afternoon and used a falsified deed in my name as collateral. You committed federal credit fraud. You knowingly deceived a national financial institution. The penalty for that offense is up to 20 years in federal prison." Marcus's face went from pale to corpse white. His eyes widened in raw horror. He staggered back one step. The gold fountain pen slipped from his hand and rolled across the wooden platform. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. It was as if his throat had suddenly closed around his own terror. "At 8 o'clock this morning," I said flatly, "I sent the full evidence package of your fraudulent loan file to the IRS and the FBI. They confirmed receipt. So no, Marcus, you are not just losing that yacht. You have just personally incinerated your career, your professional license, and your entire future because you thought stealing from an old woman would be easy." Crash! The sound sliced through the dead silence of the garden. Marcus had just dropped the crystal glass in his hand. It shattered across the marble floor, splashing red wine like blood across his polished leather shoes. He stood there trembling, breathing hard, completely unraveling in front of every business contact he had spent years trying to impress. I never blinked. I turned my head slowly and looked at my daughter standing frozen beside him. The first blow had landed, and I was nowhere near finished. Marcus had just dropped his wine glass. The entire crowd went dead silent. Then Chloe lunged forward, stepping around the shattered crystal, her face burning red with fury. She pointed straight at me, her voice slicing through the night like a knife. "What kind of insane nonsense are you saying, Mom?" she screamed. "You're accusing my husband in front of everyone. Dad was right. You really have lost your mind. You need to be locked away." Slowly I turned and looked at my 34-year-old daughter. She was wearing a custom silk dress, and in her hand was a rare designer handbag, so expensive it practically screamed wealth. I fixed my eyes on that bag and kept staring until even Chloe began to look down at it nervously. "That's a beautiful bag, Chloe," I said calmly. $65,000, isn't it? A very impressive number for a woman who has never worked a single day in her life. Chloe jerked her head up and took a step back. She tried to keep her arrogance intact, but panic had already begun to creep into her eyes. "It was a gift from Marcus," she shot back, though her voice trembled slightly. "What are you jealous?" I gave a small shake of my head. "No, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the speakers. That was not a gift from Marcus. He doesn't have that kind of liquid cash. That handbag, along with your 3 European vacations and your entire collection of luxury jewelry, was paid for with corporate credit cards issued under the name of Sterling's Children's Charity Foundation. The crowd erupted into furious murmurs. Several of the guests standing in that garden had personally donated money to that charity. Will stood frozen on stage, mouth slightly open, as if he still couldn't believe what he was hearing. And I was not finished. You and your husband embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from tax-exempt charitable funds to finance your luxury lifestyle. I continued, my cold voice cutting through the air. You assumed that because I handled the internal books I would keep covering for you, that I would go on closing my eyes and cleaning up your filth forever. But this morning I turned over 10 years of your credit card statements to federal financial investigators. You're lying, Chloe screamed. But her voice cracked apart in the middle of the sentence. She looked around desperately searching for support, but every one of her polished society friends was avoiding her eyes. By Monday morning, I said your bank accounts will be frozen. That bag will be seized. The dress you're wearing will be seized. The sports car you're driving will be seized. You are about to become a penniless tax criminal with nothing left to your name. Chloe's knees gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the lawn, covering her face with shaking hands as sobs tore through her body, ruining her expensive makeup. In one brutal moment, all of her arrogance had been smashed to pieces. And right then Jason stormed onto the stage. His face was bright red with rage. His fists were clenched tight as he came at me with open menace in his eyes. "That's enough," Jason snarled. "You've gone completely insane. You're destroying this family because you're jealous of us. Sign over the shares and get out of here. If you don't, I swear I'll hit publish right now. I'll tell the whole world what kind of monster you really are." He yanked out his phone and waved it in front of me like a weapon. 200 guests stood there holding their breath, watching every movement. I looked at my youngest son, 30 years old, jobless, talentless, and I smiled. It was a smile he had never seen from me in all his life. "Go ahead, Jason," I said softly. "Post everything. Call me a monster. Call me a devil. Say whatever you want. But there is one thing you can no longer do." I let the silence stretch for one sharp, deadly beat. "You can no longer use my shares to launch your startup or pay off your gambling debts." Jason froze. His fingers stopped above the screen. "What do you mean?" he asked, and for the first time fear crept into his voice. I turned toward the crowd and searched for one familiar face in the third row. There he was, Richard, the chairman of Will's biggest rival in the real estate industry. He stood there smiling calmly, lifting his glass of red wine toward me. "My 15% stake in Sterling," I announced, my voice ringing across the garden, "no longer belongs to me. And it certainly will never belong to you. I sold every last share to Richard's corporation at 9 o'clock this morning. The money has already been transferred into an international bank account. You have no shares, Jason. You have no company. You have no voice on the board. You are nothing more than a 30-year-old failure with not a single asset in his own name." Jason's phone slipped from his hand. It hit the marble floor and shattered on impact. He staggered backward, his eyes hollow as he stared at me like I was a stranger. Every dream he had been clinging to, every fantasy of power and control he thought was just within his reach, had vanished in a single morning. I stood on that stage and looked down at my 3 children. Marcus stood frozen beside the puddle of spilled red wine. Chloe was on her knees in the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. Jason was staring at the broken phone at his feet, like his soul had just left his body. Yesterday in that kitchen, they had been arrogant, cruel, and absolutely certain they could crush me. They believed I was nothing more than a weak old woman they could corner, pressure, and suffocate. But here on this stage, in front of everyone, I showed them what real power looks like. The power of a woman who had spent an entire lifetime cleaning up the wreckage they created. And this blow, this was only the beginning. Because now I was about to turn and deal with the greatest enemy of my entire life. Will roared. His face had turned crimson with pure, uncontrollable rage. He snatched a backup microphone from the trembling hand of a waiter, and his voice exploded across the party, shattering the stunned silence in the garden. "Call the police right now," Will bellowed, pointing straight at me. "She's insane. She's a thief. She's trying to slander this family and steal my property. Security. Get this crazy woman out of here now." But not one of the 200 guests moved. The security team Will had hired stood frozen in place. They were smart enough to understand who truly held the power now. I stood there and looked at the man I had once called my husband. He was panting. Sweat soaked his forehead, ruining the careful perfection of his slicked-back hair. The polished image of a powerful, charming executive had completely fallen apart. All that remained was a pathetic, panicked old man unraveling in public. "And what exactly are you planning to have me arrested for, Will?" I asked calmly, every word landing like stone. "For stealing my own property. You can't call the police on the lawful owner of these assets. It's my company." Will screamed, slamming his fist onto the wooden podium. "It's my house. You're nothing but a freeloading housewife. You have no rights here. I built this empire with my own 2 hands." I let out a soft laugh. A cold, merciless sound echoed through the speakers. "You really believe your own lies, don't you?" "Will," I said, "you really think your sloppy paperwork, your fake payroll records, and your cheap little tax schemes could fool federal authorities for 35 years? I took one step forward. The distance between us shrank. The crowd held its breath. No glasses clinked. No one coughed. No one whispered. My voice was the only sound filling the entire garden. "5 years ago, you got hit with a serious audit," I said slowly. "You were drunk, crying, begging me to save you from prison for financial fraud. I stayed awake for 30 straight nights cleaning up your mess. I ate nights cleaning up your mess. I rebuilt the entire corporate structure from the ground up. And when you signed that 500-page restructuring package, you never bothered to read a single word. You were too lazy, too arrogant, too certain that anything handed to you by a woman couldn't possibly matter." Will's eyes widened. The hand holding the microphone began to shake violently. His throat made strangled little sounds, but no words came out. "You signed over the entire company." I declared, each word sharp and undeniable. "Every property, including this $12 million estate, and every retirement fund into an irrevocable trust. The name of that trust is the Sterling Protection Trust. And the only person with voting authority, the only beneficiary, and the only person with the power to dissolve that trust is me." A wave of shock tore through the crowd. The bankers, the attorneys, the financial insiders standing in that garden understood immediately what that meant. An irrevocable trust was a legal fortress. And 5 years ago, Will had signed away his kingdom with his own hand. "On paper, Will," I said with a smile as bitter as poison, "you are nothing more than an employee, a salaried executive being paid by my trust. And as the sole controlling authority of that trust, I am officially terminating your employment here and now. You no longer have a company. You no longer have a house. And you do not have $1 single left that you can call your own." Will staggered backward as if I had hit him in the chest with a sledgehammer. One hand flew to his heart. His breathing turned ragged, shallow, desperate. But I still wasn't done. My eyes shifted slowly to the young woman standing beside him like a statue. "Vanessa," I said. The arrogant mistress from earlier was now clutching her pregnant belly, her face drained completely white. "You thought you had trapped a billionaire, didn't you, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice dripping with pity and contempt. "You thought you were about to move into this house, push an old woman out onto the street, and enjoy the life of a powerful man's wife. You thought the child you're carrying would inherit an empire." Vanessa shook her head wildly, tears already spilling down her face. "No," she stammered. "Will told me he owned everything. He said you had nothing." "He lied to you," I said coldly. "Just like he lied to shareholders. Just like he lied to federal securities regulators. This morning, I sent the original books, the real books he tried so hard to bury, to federal investigators. He is not just broke, Vanessa. He is about to face the 10-year criminal sentence for securities fraud." Vanessa let out a sharp, broken scream. She stumbled away from Will as if he were contagious. Then she tripped and fell onto the lawn, but not one person among those 200 powerful guests stepped forward to help her. "You are not carrying a billionaire's child, Vanessa," I said, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. "You are carrying the child of a white-collar criminal who is about to go to prison. There will be no mansion, no glamorous future, only massive legal bills and endless questioning. Congratulations. You won him. He is all yours." The entire garden sank into deathly silence. The 200 most powerful people in New York had just witnessed the complete and total destruction of the Sterling family. They came expecting to watch an aging woman be publicly discarded. Instead, they watched the true architect of the empire detonate the bomb that reduced it all to ash. I stood on that stage and looked down at the ruins of the people who had once tried to bury me, and in that moment the feeling was absolutely glorious. I stood on the wooden platform looking down at the people who had just been stripped of every ounce of power they thought they had. The silence in the garden was no longer shock. It was fear, real fear. The powerful guests began whispering to one another, slowly stepping back, creating a wide, empty circle around my family. Instinctively, they were already distancing themselves from people who were about to fall straight into criminal disaster. Then Marcus exploded, shattering the silence with a desperate wave of his hand. Every trace of arrogance that once belonged to the polished wealth manager was gone now. All that remained was the ugly, pathetic instinct of a man fighting for survival. "You're lying," Marcus shouted, sweat beading across his forehead. "You can't do this. No trust on earth can get past my legal team. Who do you think you are? You're just a confused old woman trying to scare us with cheap legal nonsense. I'm calling my chief attorney right now. He'll tear your ridiculous paperwork to pieces." His hand fumbled into his pocket and he yanked out the newest phone model with shaking fingers. He wanted to prove he still had power in front of 200 guests. He wanted to crush me beneath the weight of expensive suits and male authority. So he made a very stupid mistake. He put the call on speaker. The ringing echoed clearly through the party sound system because he was standing right beside the stage. 3 full rings passed before a deep, confident voice finally answered. "Good evening, Marcus," the lawyer said. "I'm at a dinner event. What's so urgent that you're calling me at this hour?" "David," Marcus shouted into the phone, his voice cracking with panic, "I need you to step in right now. My mother-in-law, Kate Sterling, has lost her mind. She refuses to sign the power of attorney papers. She just announced that all of this family's assets, including the company and the Aspen House, are inside some irrevocable trust. And now she's threatening that she already reported me to the IRS and the FBI for federal credit fraud. Tell her she has no right to do this. Strip her control away right now." A short silence followed on the other end. The lawyer's confident tone vanished. What replaced it was immediate caution. "Slow down, Marcus," the attorney said, his voice suddenly much slower. "Did you just say your mother-in-law accused you of federal credit fraud? You filed the Aspen mortgage application using falsified documents after I warned you not to do that, didn't you?" "That is not the issue right now," Marcus yelled. "She's trying to throw us out of the house. You're my lawyer. You fix this. Tell her that trust is worthless." I stepped down one stair and moved closer to Marcus. Then I leaned toward the phone, still broadcasting on speaker. "Good evening, David," I said, my voice so calm and polite it became terrifying. "This is Kate Sterling. Before I was married, I was known as Catherine Vance, Senior Forensic Auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. The trust Marcus is referring to is the Sterling Protection Trust. I personally established it, and it was validated by a federal judge of the New York Supreme Court exactly 5 years ago. Every asset your client is attempting to mortgage belongs exclusively to that trust. And yes, I already submitted the full evidence package of Marcus's fraud to the FBI, along with your name if you advised him to proceed." The silence on the other end became so complete people could practically hear the attorney breathing. All 200 guests held their breath too. A former IRS forensic auditor, combined with a federally fortified protection trust, was the legal equivalent of a death sentence for any commercial attorney caught near a fraud case. "Mrs. Sterling," the lawyer said at last, his voice suddenly respectful and slightly unsteady. I assure you, I had no knowledge of Marcus's unlawful actions. I explicitly advised him not to file that application. I am not involved in this fraud. David, what the hell are you saying? Marcus roared. You're my lawyer. You are supposed to protect me. Listen carefully, Marcus. The lawyer snapped his tone, turning cold and ruthless. I cannot represent you. You just admitted to federal credit fraud on a live speakerphone call in front of a former federal forensic auditor. An irrevocable trust is a steel legal structure. If Mrs. Sterling says she controls it, then she controls it. You have just dug your own grave. Do not call me again. I am formally withdrawing as your attorney effective immediately. Then came the long, flat tone. The call was over. The powerful attorney Marcus had always bragged about had run for his life the second he heard my name. The phone slipped from Marcus's hand and dropped into the grass. He stood there with his shoulders collapsing inward, his face twisting with absolute despair. The illusion of power those slick men in expensive suits loved so much had just been crushed by a single phone call. Men like them always believed the worlds of finance and law belonged only to them. They believed women were outsiders' decorations, observers, never players. Will took another step back and braced himself against the edge of the marble table so he would not fall. He had just watched the last remaining hope of his family get extinguished. The legal wall I had built was not just strong, it was a fortress. I did not need to scream, I did not need to argue. I used the very law they worshipped to bind their hands and feet until they could no longer move. Then I slowly turned and looked straight at my 3 children and the husband who had betrayed me. The power game was over. Now it was time to carry out the final eviction. I lifted my hand into the air and snapped my fingers once. It was a tiny sound, but it triggered the final step of my plan. At once, 6 men in black suits emerged from the darkness of the garden. They were not the security staff Will had hired for the party. They were my security team elite private professionals I had personally selected and paid a full month in advance through the trust account. Their captain, a former military man with a face carved from stone, walked straight onto the platform and stopped just behind me with his hands clasped in front of him. His presence alone was enough to crush any thought of physical resistance from the men in my family. At the same time, the other 5 moved swiftly toward the entrances of the estate. They slammed the giant oak doors shut and locked the iron bolts into place. The cold metallic sound rang through the night hard, final, merciless. The 200 guests began whispering and stepping back, opening a wide path down the center. They understood now. Tonight, they were not just party guests. They were legal witnesses to a historic expulsion. I looked straight at Will, who was still leaning against the banquet table, gasping for breath. Then I turned to Marcus, who stood there staring hopelessly at his shattered phone. Then I looked at my 3 trembling children. This house no longer belongs to any of you, I declared, my voice echoing across the estate without a trace of mercy. The Sterling Protection Trust is officially revoking all residential rights to this property for every individual whose name does not appear among its beneficiaries. You have exactly 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings and leave my property. 30 minutes, Will screamed, his voice cracking apart. You've lost your mind, Kate. You can't throw us out into the street in the middle of the night. We need more time. You didn't give me time when you planned to dump me in a nursing home tomorrow morning. I shot back immediately, slicing through his protest. In fact, 30 minutes is generosity. It is the only kindness I am giving you after 35 years of marriage. Your time starts now. Chloe rushed forward, mascara smeared across her face. Mom, you can't do this, she cried. My things, my bags, my jewelry, everything is in my room. How am I supposed to pack all of it in 30 minutes? I looked at my daughter, drowning in luxury, and gave her a cold smile. Listen carefully, Chloe, I said. Security will escort each of you to your rooms. You may take only everyday clothing and basic personal items. No expensive jewelry, no artwork, no Rolex watches, no Hermes bags. None of it leaves this house. Every one of those items was purchased with company money, which means they are now legal assets of the trust. If any of you attempts to remove even one unauthorized item, it will be treated as federal theft of property. Jason collapsed onto the lawn and grabbed his head with both hands. Mom, please, he sobbed. "I don't have any money. I have nowhere to go. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" I looked him straight in the eye. "You are a 30-year-old man, Jason," I said. "I believe it is long past time for you to answer that question for yourself. Your career as a parasite ends tonight." The head of security stepped forward and spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "All individuals named in the removal order will proceed inside the house immediately. We will supervise packing. Any resistance will result in physical restraint and notification of local law enforcement." Will, Marcus, Chloe, Jason, even Vanessa. All of them stood frozen. They looked around desperately searching for help from the powerful guests surrounding them. But not one person stepped forward. Not one person said a word. The elite are ruthless. They bow only to real power. And tonight that power belonged entirely to me. "Move!" I ordered, extending my arm and pointing straight toward the open doorway. 30 minutes. Don't make me call the police to drag each of you out in handcuffs. That was the moment they finally broke. Will moved first, dragging his feet like a man who had aged 20 years in less than an hour. Vanessa followed behind him, quietly crying. Marcus bent down, picked up the remains of his broken phone, and stumbled after them with his head lowered. Chloe and Jason followed too, their steps heavy and broken as my security team escorted them back into the house under strict watch. I remained standing on the wooden platform and drew in one slow, deep breath of the cool night air. The watch on my wrist kept ticking away the final seconds of a false empire. They were about to be thrown out of the house I had maintained, protected, and preserved with the best years of my life. They would walk into the night with empty hands and a ruined future, and I would remain here, in peace, in silence, in the life I had finally taken back with my own hands. The darkness over the garden seemed to grow heavier the moment Chloe's scream tore through the air. It was no longer the spoiled shriek of a rich man's daughter. It was the raw, broken wail of a child who had just been stripped of every toy she had ever loved. She collapsed onto the lawn, clawing at the silk of her designer gown with both hands. The expensive makeup she had spent hours perfecting was now running down her face in ugly streaks. Thick black mascara mixed with tears and smeared across her skin, turning elegance into ruin. She kept calling my name, sobbing and begging for mercy she had never once shown me in all 34 years of her life. "Mom, please don't do this," Chloe choked out. "I can't live without these things. You can't take everything from me." I walked right past her. I did not stop. I did not bend down to help her up. I only left her with one quiet sentence carried away by the night air. "You'll learn how to live, Chloe, the same way I learned how to live in invisibility for all those years." And then from behind me came a strangled sound. I turned. Will was staggering. His arms hung uselessly at his sides, and his face had gone white as paper. His right hand clutched at the left side of his chest, crushing the fine silk of his shirt in his fist. His mouth opened in desperate gasps, his eyes wide with pain and terror. A mild heart attack had finally arrived, the inevitable consequence of watching an empire of lies collapse in a single night. Will stumbled backward several steps, then dropped hard to both knees on the cold marble. Vanessa let out a terrified scream and backed away from him instead of rushing forward. She had no intention of helping the man whose child she was carrying. Marcus and Jason stood frozen too. Their cowardice had never looked clearer. Not one single member of that so-called family stepped forward to catch him. Kate Will rasped his voice, weak and broken. "Help me. Let me inside. My medication, it's in my study." I stood less than 3 steps away from him, and I looked down at the man writhing at my feet. The man who had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people was now begging me for one final scrap of mercy. All 200 guests were still holding their breath. Not one of them dared interfere with the sentence I was carrying out. I did not move toward him. Instead, I turned to the head of security standing beside me. "Call an ambulance immediately." I ordered, my voice perfectly calm and precise. "Tell them we have a 65-year-old male patient showing signs of a cardiac event." The captain nodded and immediately lifted his radio. Will tried to drag himself toward the stone steps of the estate, one trembling hand stretching toward the oak doors as if he could still claim them. "Kate, let me in," he gasped. "I need to get inside. I stepped forward, once blocking his view of the house. "No, Will," I said, my voice like ice. "You will not cross that threshold ever again." Then I turned to the security team and gave the next order with cold, absolute clarity. "Keep him exactly where he is on the lawn. Under no circumstances is he to be taken back into the house. If he gets inside, he could use the medical emergency as an excuse to challenge the removal order, or worse, use the opportunity to destroy original documents still stored in my office. This scene remains secured until financial investigators and emergency personnel arrive." The instincts of a former forensic auditor left no room for softness. Will heard every word, and whatever hope he had left died on the marble beneath him. He lowered his face to the stone and groaned in pain, humiliation, and total defeat. Then in the distance the siren began. It ripped through the quiet night of the wealthy Westchester neighborhood, growing louder with every passing second. Red and blue lights flashed across the stone walls of the estate like the final signal of a kingdom's destruction. I stood there with my arms folded, watching as the paramedics rushed into the garden carrying a stretcher. They lifted Will up, and with that, they destroyed the very last illusion he had of ever clinging to that house again. The expulsion was complete, perfectly executed, and without a single legal crack for him to crawl through. The next morning, sunlight poured through the estate's towering stained glass windows. It was 7 o'clock, and for the first time in 35 years, the house was completely silent. No sharp heels from Chloe striking the marble floors. No impatient demands from Will barking for service. No roaring sports car engine from Marcus tearing through the driveway. There was only the soft, comforting sound of the coffee machine dripping hot water through freshly ground premium beans. I stood in the massive kitchen, wearing a silk robe, breathing in deeply. The air inside the house had changed. It no longer felt poisoned by expensive perfume and toxic ambition. It felt clean, light, free. I carried my cup of hot black coffee into the living room. The Persian rug that had been stamped by 200 guests the night before had already been restored by the cleaning staff sometime after midnight. The enormous landscape painting still hung proudly on the marble wall, concealing the security camera that had recorded every ridiculous, cruel word Vanessa had said. Everything in this house was exactly where it belonged. Everything belonged to me. I picked up the remote and turned on the ultra-thin flat-screen television mounted on the wall. I switched to the morning financial news. Normally, Will always claimed the remote for himself so he could watch sports or business coverage that fed his vanity. But this morning, I was the one deciding what would be on the screen. The television lit up with the image of a gleaming glass office tower in the heart of Manhattan, Sterling Real Estate headquarters. But today, there were no elegant executives in sharp suits walking through the front doors. Instead, yellow police barriers surrounded the building, and dozens of federal securities agents were hurrying in and out carrying cardboard boxes of documents to a line of waiting trucks. The financial news anchor spoke in a grave, urgent tone. "A shocking development has hit New York's real estate world this morning. Sterling headquarters is currently under emergency search by federal securities authorities. Internal sources say investigators received an anonymous criminal complaint file containing extensive evidence of accounting fraud, tax evasion, and investor deception allegedly committed over more than a decade by CEO William Sterling." I took a slow sip of coffee. The bitterness was perfect. Will had survived the mild heart attack the night before. The paramedics had taken him to a general hospital, not a luxurious private facility, because the trust had already declined coverage on his insurance card. He woke up in a hospital bed with his body weakened and broken. But the heart attack was only the beginning. When he opened his eyes, he was not greeted by the loving arms of his young mistress. He was greeted by a cold federal court summons. Vanessa had almost certainly grabbed the last designer bag she could carry and disappeared the moment she realized Will no longer had a single dollar to his name. She had no reason to stay and care for an old man headed for prison. The news shifted to another update. The collapse of the Sterling Empire does not end with its CEO, the anchor continued. Federal financial regulators have also issued an indefinite suspension of the professional license of Marcus Sterling, senior wealth manager and son-in-law of William Sterling. Marcus is now under investigation in connection with a serious credit fraud case involving forged documents used to secure multi-million-dollar collateral. Authorities are currently moving to freeze his bank accounts. I smiled, a real smile, peaceful, bright. Marcus, the man who had called himself a financial genius, the man who had stood in my kitchen mocking the knowledge of an old woman he thought only knew how to bake, was now being dragged across national television in disgrace. His wealth management firm had already fired him to save its own reputation. No bank would touch him. No client would trust him. No institution in New York's financial world would hand even the smallest contract to a man under federal investigation. Marcus had been erased from the map of high finance with a single press of a button from me. I walked slowly down the long hallway, looking at the empty spaces on the walls where the fake family portraits used to hang. I had taken them down myself the night before. I no longer needed those carefully framed lies. I thought of Chloe, my daughter, who had never learned how to earn one honest dollar with her own hands. The night before, she had been forced to leave carrying a tiny suitcase filled with a few cheap outfits and move into a miserable roadside motel on the outskirts of town. She would wake up this morning with no black credit card, no luxury handbags, no upper-class friends to impress or lean on. Her education in adulthood had officially begun. And it had begun in the cruelest classroom reality could offer. Then there was Jason, my youngest son, the boy who had built his whole identity around playing the victim and manipulating everyone around him. He had grown used to being indulged, funded, and carried through life by the family's money without ever breaking a sweat. This morning he would not be opening his laptop to write a slanderous social media post threatening his own mother. He would be opening it to search desperately for some entry-level job, maybe carrying plates in a diner just to afford breakfast. His illusion of power was gone. The morning sun rose brilliantly over the wreckage of a family that had rotted from the inside out. People always say that women in their 60s should endure, should stay quiet, should close their eyes and preserve the family home no matter how cold, poisonous, and humiliating that home becomes. They call it sacrifice, the noble duty of a wife, the holy patience of a mother. But I call it something else. I call it the slow suicide of the soul. I gave 35 years of my life to laying every brick of this house. I repaired their mistakes. I covered their greed. I fed their arrogance with my silence, and they mistook all of it for weakness. They thought I did it because I was dependent on them, because I was powerless, because I no longer knew how to stand on my own feet. What they never understood was something very simple. The person who has the patience to build an empire, brick by brick, also has the intelligence and the ice in her veins to bring it down to the foundation. I set my coffee cup on the marble table outside the terrace and looked out across the wide, sunlit garden full of birdsong and morning light, and I felt the steady beat of my own heart inside my chest. This enormous estate did not feel empty. It did not feel lonely. It felt purified, like a nest finally cleared of the parasites that had been feeding on it for years. It was a place of absolute stillness, absolute clarity, the kind of peace I had been starving for all my life. This was not a tragic ending. This was the first morning of a brand new life, a life where I no longer had to play the role of the obedient wife, or the mother they treated with contempt. I was the only true winner left on the chessboard I had built with my own hands, and I intended to savor every second of the freedom I had finally claimed. I walked slowly down the long marble hallway. The soft wheels of my small suitcase rolled behind me in a calm, steady rhythm. It was a simple, dark brown leather suitcase. No flashy designer logo, no need to impress anyone. Inside were only a few neatly folded clothes, one favorite book, and a slim legal file that looked harmless but carried enough power to destroy an empire. Unlike the oversized trunks of panic that those people had dragged out of the house the night before, my suitcase was the symbol of a departure that had been calculated with absolute precision. When you are a woman past 60, the world has a habit of looking straight through you. They treat you like an old piece of furniture in the corner of the house, something invisible, something useful only when they want a hot meal, a perfectly ironed shirt, or a quiet body to absorb all the bitterness they bring home from the outside world. For 35 years, I played that role flawlessly. I baked thousands of apple pies. I smiled politely through hundreds of elegant dinner parties. I nodded and listened to my husband's hollow bragging and my children's selfish complaints as if that was all I had been born to do. They looked at my silence and called it weakness. They looked at my patience and called it stupidity. But what they completely forgot was who I had been before I ever became their wife and mother. They forgot that underneath that kitchen apron had always lived the mind of a forensic auditor, a woman who made her living by finding cracks, by tracking lies, by uncovering the evidence people thought they had buried forever. In the natural world, the greatest predators never roar before the kill. They do not show off their power. They lower themselves into the grass. They disappear. They watch. And they wait. My sacrifice over those 35 years was never self-destruction. It was patience. The terrifying patience of a hunter waiting for the prey to walk willingly into the trap with the door already open. Every time Will brought home some shady contract and asked me to clean up his mess, I never complained. I simply made a copy and placed it quietly inside my private safe. Every time Chloe used the Charity Foundation's credit card to fund another shopping spree, I did not scold her. I just kept every receipt and filed it carefully into folders marked in red. Every time Marcus smirked at me and gave one of his condescending lectures about money, I did not argue. I smiled. And I let him reveal his greed and ignorance all by himself. I let them believe in their own power. I gave them enough rope to tie the noose around their own necks. People love to say revenge is a dish best served cold, but this was no longer revenge. This was purification. This was surgery. The removal of the toxic growths that had rooted themselves into my life for far too long. I stopped in front of the large oak doors and pushed them open gently. Brilliant morning sunlight poured across the path ahead of me. I took one deep breath of the fresh morning air. That $12 million estate now belonged entirely under my control. But I had no intention of spending the rest of my life trapped inside a cold, silent museum of pain. I was going to sell it. I would donate part of it to people who truly needed help. And with the rest, I would buy back the life that had always belonged to me. I pulled my suitcase forward and stepped down the stone stairs. Every step felt strangely light. The burden of being the perfect wife, the burden of being the endlessly sacrificing mother. It was gone, completely gone. I no longer had to protect anyone from the consequences of their own corruption. I no longer had to live in the shadow of any man. For 35 years, I had been the architect of this family's wealth, and today I officially became the architect of my own freedom. Top of form. Bottom of form. A sleek, black luxury SUV pulled up sharply in front of the marble steps. The driver, dressed in a gray uniform, stepped out, opened the door, and carefully placed my small suitcase into the trunk. I never looked back at the $12 million mansion, not even once. I slid into the soft leather back seat, and the car began to move, gliding slowly through the massive wrought iron gates. In the rearview mirror, I watched the shape of the house fade into the distance until it disappeared completely behind the old oak trees. I was not heading to a grocery store. I was not going to another dull little tea party with the upper class. My destination was the international airport. A first-class ticket to Tuscany, Italy, was already waiting in my handbag. There, a beautiful old villa stood overlooking endless vineyards soaked in warm, golden sunlight. That villa also belonged to another trust, one I personally established and controlled. That was where I would begin the next chapter of my life. A chapter with no nagging, no lies, and absolutely no ingratitude. People always say that once a woman passes 50 or 60, her life is basically written. Society teaches us that the greatest wealth an older woman can have is her children and grandchildren. They condition us to believe that we are supposed to drain every last drop of strength, every last dollar of savings, just to roll out a red carpet for the next generation. They tell us we must clench our teeth and endure unfaithful husbands just to preserve a fake, picture-perfect family for outsiders to admire. but I want to tell you a truth that no one wants women like us to fully understand. Your money is yours. Your sweat is yours. Your tears are yours. Your youth is yours. You do not owe anyone a free ticket through your life. Your sacrifice is a priceless gift. It is not a mandatory obligation. And when that gift is trampled on, disrespected, and thrown into the trash, you have every right to take it back. You have every right to walk away carrying everything that belongs to you. Life does not end at 60. For me, it has only just begun. The golden years are not the years you spend slowly fading away in an armchair, waiting for a polite phone call from children who do not care. The golden years are the years when you are finally free. Free to sip a glass of fine wine in a distant country paid for with the money you were wise enough to protect for yourself. Live for yourself before it is too late. Never burn yourself alive, just to keep warm the people who do not appreciate your fire. And if you are watching this video right now, and you are also a woman who gave everything only to be repaid with disrespect, I need you to know something. You still have power. That power lives in your legal documents, in your independent bank accounts, and in your clear mind. Never hand over the keys to your life to anyone who believes you no longer have value. That is my story. A former forensic auditor, a mother who was rejected, a wife who was betrayed, and now a woman who is completely free. Now I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to take harsh measures to teach your own family a lesson about respect? What would you do if you were in my position? If this story gave you strength, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video. Your support is what gives me the energy to keep sharing the rawest, most powerful stories. And do not forget to check the link in the description. In the next video, I will tell you another story just as dramatic as this one. It is the story of a woman who used a hidden prenuptial agreement, buried for 20 years, to leave her narcissistic husband and his young mistress with absolutely nothing except a mountain of debt. Trust me, you do not want to miss that twist. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in Tuscany.